Welcome to the channel where history comes alive, unlocking the secrets of the past like never before. Today we uncover the untold truths behind the Japan versus America war, the real motives, secret missions, and jaw-dropping betrayals that history never taught you. Strap in. This is going to change how you see World War II forever. It's truly enjoyable. Let's start in the years leading up to World War II. Japan was a growing imperial power in Asia with massive ambitions to expand its empire. However, these ambitions came with a major limitation. Japan lacked many of the natural resources it needed to sustain its rapid industrial and military growth, especially oil. Over 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States, along with critical materials like steel, rubber, and scrap metal. Japan's military actions in China, particularly the brutal invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and later the full-scale war with China in 1937, increasingly drew international condemnation. As Japan continued to push deeper into China and later began eyeing Southeast Asia for its rich resources, tensions with the West, particularly the United States, began to escalate. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, viewed Japanese aggression as a direct threat to American interests in the Pacific and to the balance of power in Asia. In response, the U.S. began placing increasing economic pressure on Japan. In July 1941, following Japan's occupation of French Indochina, the United States made a decisive move. It froze all Japanese assets in the U.S. and, more significantly, imposed a full oil embargo. This was a devastating blow. Without oil, Japan's Navy, Air Force, and entire war machine would grind to a halt within months. Japan faced a critical choice: withdraw from its conquests in China and Southeast Asia, which would be politically and militarily humiliating, or strike out against the Western powers to secure new oil sources and cripple their ability to respond. Japanese leaders, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and military strategists, saw no option but to go to war. The oil embargo didn't just pressure Japan, it cornered it. Plans began rapidly forming for a preemptive strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, aiming to destroy America's naval strength before it could interfere with Japan's seizure of resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. The embargo had turned a tense situation into an inevitable conflict, setting the stage for one of the most pivotal wars in modern history. Pearl Harbor attack had prior warnings. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, is often remembered as a total surprise, an unprovoked, unexpected strike that shocked the United States into war. However, behind the scenes, several warning signs and intercepted communications hinted at Japan's intentions well before the bombs fell. American cryptographers had made significant progress in breaking Japanese diplomatic codes through an intelligence project called MAGIC. As early as 1941, U.S. intelligence was intercepting messages that clearly indicated Japan was preparing for war if negotiations failed. In the weeks leading up to the attack, tension was rising rapidly. American naval commanders and intelligence analysts received various indicators that suggested an imminent Japanese military operation. For instance, the Japanese fleet had gone unusually silent on radio channels, a tactic often used to conceal movements. Additionally, military observers noted increased Japanese naval activity and suspicious ship movements in the Pacific. Perhaps most telling of all was a message intercepted on December 6th, which included a 14-part reply from Japan to the U.S., with the final part arriving hours before the attack. It broke off diplomatic relations, a common prelude to war. Yet despite this, there was no full alert issued to Pearl Harbor. Miscommunication, bureaucratic delays, and perhaps underestimation of Japan's audacity contributed to the lack of preparedness. Some historians argue that the Roosevelt administration had enough clues to anticipate a Japanese strike, though not necessarily at Pearl Harbor. Others suggest the possibility of deliberate inaction, theorizing that the U.S. government may have wanted a provocation to justify entering the war. While that remains controversial, what is clear is that Pearl Harbor was not as unpredictable as many believe. The signs were there. They just weren't acted upon. Japan planned to attack U.S. mainland. While most historical narratives focus on Japan's offensive actions in the Pacific, such as Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Midway, what's often left out is that Japan had considered and even attempted attacks on the U.S. mainland. These plans were not large-scale invasions, but rather targeted operations meant to instill fear, disrupt the American war effort, and demonstrate Japan's reach. As early as 1941, Japanese military leaders discussed the feasibility of long-range attacks on American soil. Although Japan understood that a full-scale invasion of the continental United States was logistically impossible, smaller acts of sabotage and psychological warfare were well within their capabilities. One of the most notable attempts came in 1942, when a Japanese submarine surfaced near Santa Barbara, California, and shelled an oil refinery. Though the damage was minimal, the event sparked panic along the West Coast. That same year, Japanese submarines also patrolled the waters off the WWII, Oregon and Washington coasts, sometimes launching reconnaissance planes or firing shells at coastal targets. These small raids were designed more to unsettle the American public than to cause strategic harm. Perhaps the most bizarre and ambitious of Japan's mainland plans was the deployment of Fugo balloon bombs. Beginning in late 1944, the Japanese military launched over 9,000 high-altitude balloons carrying incendiary devices. These were carried by the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean to North America. The hope was that the bombs would ignite massive forest fires, destroy infrastructure, and force the U.S. to divert resources away from the war in the Pacific. While most of the balloons failed to reach their targets, at least a few made it. Tragically, 6 civilians in Oregon, including 5 children, were killed when one of the bombs exploded. These were the only known fatalities from enemy action on the U.S. mainland during World War II. Japan also explored the idea of using long-range aircraft launched from submarines, an experimental design known as the I-400 class, to bomb the Panama Canal or American cities. Though these plans never came to fruition, the very existence of such ideas reveals the extent of Japan's ambition and creativity in waging unconventional warfare. These attempts to attack the U.S. mainland, while limited in scale, represent a chilling reminder that the war's reach extended far beyond the Pacific Islands and Asian territories. Kamikaze pilots were often coerced. The image of the kamikaze pilot willingly sacrificing himself by diving his aircraft into enemy ships, has become one of the most iconic and tragic symbols of Japan's desperation in the final years of World War II. The word kamikaze means divine wind, harking back to the typhoons that, according to legend, saved Japan from Mongol invasions centuries earlier. In 1944, as Japan faced mounting defeats, its leaders revived this ancient imagery in WWII, a desperate bid to turn the tide of war. Kamikaze attacks became a military strategy, with young pilots trained specifically to crash their planes into Allied warships, creating maximum destruction. While some pilots volunteered for these missions out of patriotic fervor or belief in Bushido, the samurai code of honor, the reality is far more complex. Many of these young men were not given a real choice. The pressure to volunteer was immense. Military culture, societal expectations, and fear of dishonoring one's family often left pilots with no alternative. Refusing a kamikaze mission could result in severe shame, ostracization, or accusations of cowardice. In a society where duty to the emperor was paramount, such rejection was unthinkable for most. There are documented cases of pilots being told they were volunteering when, in reality, their superiors had already made the decision for them. Others were manipulated through emotionally charged speeches or peer pressure within their squadrons. Some pilots wrote final letters filled with conflicted emotions, revealing their doubts and fear. These letters, often censored or destroyed, offer a haunting glimpse into the minds of young men sent to die in the name of honor. The aircraft used for kamikaze missions were often stripped-down fighters, sometimes even obsolete planes loaded with extra fuel and explosives. Pilots received minimal training, enough only to aim and dive. The conditions were grim. Many suffered from mechanical failures, missed targets, or were shot down before reaching the enemy. The narrative of kamikaze pilots as noble volunteers masks a darker truth, that many were coerced, manipulated, or left, with no real choice. Japan's militaristic leadership exploited the patriotism and youth of its own people, turning them into tools of destruction in a war they knew they were losing. Unit 731 conducted human experiments. One of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of World War II remains largely unknown outside of historical and academic circles: the atrocities committed by Japan's Unit 731. Officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731 was in reality a covert biological and chemical warfare research division that carried out horrific human experimentation in northeastern China. Led by General Shiro Ishii, the unit operated in a massive complex near Harbin, Manchuria, where thousands of men, women, and children, mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, were subjected to unimaginable torture and death in the Yang, name of science and military advancement. The prisoners, referred to as logs by the researchers to dehumanize them, were used in experiments that rivaled the horrors of Nazi medical testing. Victims were infected with deadly diseases such as bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid to study the effects and progression of illness. Often, these infections were combined or varied by temperature, dosage, or exposure to study different outcomes. In many cases, subjects were dissected alive without anesthesia, so researchers could observe organ function in real time as the disease spread. Other experiments tested the effects of frostbite by exposing victims to freezing temperatures and then attempting crude resuscitation methods. Limbs were sometimes amputated and reattached to different parts of the body or compared for decomposition. Pregnant women were not spared, and fetuses were used in forced birth studies. Victims were also subjected to weapons testing, including live grenade explosions, flamethrowers, and chemical weapons to measure blast radius and internal injuries. What is particularly chilling is that these atrocities were not only sanctioned by the Japanese military, but were conducted under a scientific guise. The goal was to develop effective biological weapons that could be used against enemy populations, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Plague bombs developed by Unit 731 were dropped on Chinese cities, killing untold numbers of civilians and creating outbreaks that spread beyond the immediate targets. At the end of the war, rather than being prosecuted for war crimes, many of Unit 731's leaders were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. General Ishii and others escaped justice, with some even going on to hold prominent positions in Japan's post-war medical and academic institutions. This deal was part of a broader Cold War strategy, as the U.S. sought to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining access to Japan's biological warfare knowledge. The existence of Unit 731 remained a suppressed topic in Japan for decades, and only began receiving wider attention in recent years through survivor testimonies and historical investigations. Japan sought surrender before Hiroshima. By mid-1945, Japan was militarily defeated, its cities devastated by relentless American firebombing campaigns, and its naval and air power virtually annihilated. Yet the country had not officially surrendered. What many people do not realize is that Japan had been exploring ways to end the war before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These efforts were not straightforward, and they were complicated by internal divisions within the Japanese government, where the military faction still held significant influence and was reluctant to accept unconditional surrender as demanded by the Allies. Japanese diplomats had begun using back channels to approach the Soviet Union, which at that time was still neutral, hoping to broker a negotiated peace. The idea was to persuade the Soviets to mediate with the United States and Britain on Japan's behalf, potentially allowing the country to retain its imperial system and avoid complete occupation. These overtures were made with caution, as Japan feared both internal backlash and external humiliation. Nevertheless, diplomatic communications, such as those from Japanese ambassador Naotake Sato in Moscow, indicated that there was growing urgency within some circles of the Japanese leadership to end the war, especially before a Soviet entry into the conflict. The U.S., through intercepted communications under the MAGIC program, was aware of these attempts. However, American leadership remained firm on demanding unconditional surrender, including the removal of Emperor Hirohito's authority, a non-negotiable point for many within Japan. President Truman and his advisors believed that only overwhelming force could compel Japan's leadership to capitulate, especially the militarists who were determined to fight to the last man. Some American officials, like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, were more open to modifying surrender terms to hasten the end of the war, but this view did not prevail. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, followed by Nagasaki on August 9th, is often justified as the action that forced Japan to surrender. However, some historians argue that the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan and its swift invasion of Manchuria on August 8th had an equal, if not greater, impact on Japan's decision-making. The fear of a Soviet occupation, combined with the realization that continued resistance would lead to complete annihilation, shifted the balance within the Japanese Supreme War Council. Documents and post-war testimony suggest that several Japanese leaders, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Emperor Hirohito himself, had already been leaning toward ending the war before the bombings. They hoped to secure peace while preserving the imperial institution. The atomic bombings, combined with the Soviet invasion, ultimately pushed the internal debate toward surrender. Atomic bombs used to intimidate USSR. The conventional narrative surrounding the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they were necessary to force Japan's surrender and end World War II swiftly, sparing countless lives that would have been lost in a full-scale invasion. However, many historians argue that another motive lurked beneath the surface, one directed not at Japan, but at the Soviet Union. By mid-1945, the United States and the USSR were already beginning to drift into what would soon become the Cold War. Tensions over post-war influence in Europe and Asia were intensifying, and President Truman and his advisors recognized that the atom bomb could serve a dual purpose: to end the war with Japan and to demonstrate America's overwhelming military superiority to Stalin. The U.S. had successfully tested the first atomic bomb in July 1945 at the Trinity site in New Mexico. Truman, who had recently taken office after Roosevelt's death, was informed of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Reports suggest that Truman became noticeably more assertive after learning of the bomb's power. Though the bomb was not directly discussed at the conference, Truman hinted to Stalin that the U.S. had developed a powerful new weapon. Stalin, already aware through Soviet espionage efforts, pretended to be unimpressed. Strategically, the bomb was a trump card. The U.S. military did not need to use it solely to defeat Japan, as conventional bombing had already razed dozens of Japanese cities, and Japan's ability to resist was all but gone. The bomb's sudden and unprecedented destruction offered something more, a way to shock the world, particularly the Soviets, into recognizing the new balance of power. Dropping the atomic bomb sent a message. The United States now had unmatched destructive capability, and it was willing to use it. Some members of Truman's inner circle, including Secretary of State James Burns, believed the demonstration of atomic power would give the U.S. more leverage in negotiations over post-war Europe and Asia. Burns even suggested that the bomb might make the Soviets more manageable in Eastern Europe, where Stalin was already expanding his influence. This added a political calculus to the military decision. Furthermore, the timing of the bombings is crucial. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Nagasaki was bombed the following day. The proximity of these events has led many scholars to conclude that the U.S. aimed to force a Japanese surrender before the Soviets could gain a foothold in East Asia, thus excluding. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, fear and racism led to the mass internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9266, allowing the military to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast and send them to isolated internment camps. These camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed soldiers, with families losing their homes and businesses. The government never found evidence of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans, yet they were detained solely based on ethnicity. German and Italian Americans were not subjected to the same treatment. Life in the camps was harsh, with poor conditions and constant surveillance. Despite this, many internees continued to maintain a sense of normalcy, with some even volunteering to serve in the U.S. military. The internment was initially supported by the government and upheld by the Supreme Court. It wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. formally apologized, issuing reparations to surviving internees. The internment remains a stark reminder of how fear and racism can undermine civil liberties. For decades after World War II, Emperor Hirohito was portrayed as a powerless figurehead, with little control over Japan's military decisions. This image was crafted partly to help maintain stability during Japan's post-war reconstruction. General MacArthur, overseeing the occupation, believed that portraying Hirohito as a symbolic leader would prevent unrest. However, historians have uncovered evidence that Hirohito was far more active than once believed. He was deeply involved in military affairs, receiving daily briefings from commanders and participating in key decisions. Hirohito approved Japan's aggressive expansion into China and Southeast Asia, and even sanctioned the use of chemical weapons. Though not directly ordering atrocities like the Nanking Massacre, he was aware of them and never condemned them. Even as Japan's situation worsened, Hirohito intervened in the decision to surrender, emphasizing the new and most cruel bomb. His post-war portrayal as a passive monarch was politically motivated, but historical records reveal a far more engaged figure, with knowledge of and consent to many military actions that challenged the peaceful image created after the war. The Pacific War was a clash of empires. The Pacific War is often framed as a conflict between the aggressive militarism of Imperial Japan and the defensive response of the United States and its allies. While this characterization holds some truth, it overlooks the broader imperial dynamics at play. In reality, the war in the Pacific was not simply a righteous fight against fascist expansion, it was also a brutal clash between empires. Japan was challenging the dominance of long-standing Western colonial powers in Asia, including Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States, all of whom held vast territories and economic interests in the region. Japan's rise as an imperial power began decades before World War II. Inspired by the Western powers' global empires, Japan sought to build its own sphere of influence. By the early 20th century, it had already annexed Korea and defeated both China and Russia in wars that expanded its territory and prestige. As the Great Depression weakened Western control in Asia, Japan saw an opportunity to expand further. Under the guise of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan promised liberation from Western colonialism, presenting itself as a leader of a new Asia-centric order. In practice, however, Japanese occupation often mirrored or exceeded the brutality of the colonial regimes they displaced. At the outbreak of war, Japan quickly conquered vast areas of Southeast Asia, including British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and French Indochina, in addition to launching an all-out invasion of China. These conquests were not just about military strategy, they were about controlling resources like oil, rubber, and tin, which were essential to sustaining Japan's industrial and military power. In challenging the West's colonial grip on Asia, Japan was asserting its own imperial ambition and demanding a seat at the table as an equal power. The United States, while championing democracy and freedom, also held significant colonial possessions in the Pacific, including the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. Many in Washington viewed Japanese expansion not only as a threat to regional stability, but also as a direct challenge to American strategic and economic interests. The conflict thus became a struggle over whose empire would dominate the Pacific. The rhetoric of liberation and justice was employed by all sides, but the underlying motivations were often rooted in power, access to resources, and global influence. Even the Allied powers' post-war plans for the region reflected imperial assumptions. Territories were not immediately granted independence, but were instead reorganized under new trusteeships or occupation regimes. Japan's defeat marked the end of its imperial ambitions, but it also signaled a realignment of power in the region, with the U.S. emerging as the dominant force in the Pacific. The clash between Japan and the Western allies, therefore, cannot be understood solely through the lens of good versus evil. It was also a struggle between rival empires vying for supremacy over a colonized and war-torn Asia. As conclusion, the Japan versus America war wasn't just about bombs and battles. It was a calculated chess game between empires. We saw how Pearl Harbor wasn't the blind side we were told, how Japan's secret horrors in Unit 731 defied humanity, and how the atomic bombs were aimed at more than just Japan, they were a warning to the world. We exposed the mass internment of Japanese Americans, revealed Hirohito's deeper involvement, and uncovered how the war was less about freedom and more about who would dominate the Pacific. History didn't forget these truths. It buried them. And here at Mysteries of Time, we dig them up, raw, real, and ready to challenge everything you thought you knew. Thanks for watching us.